My parents refused to give a gift and demanded a DNA test for my 10-year-old son during our Christmas party, right in front of 33 guests. My brother added, "He doesn't look anything like you." I simply responded, "All right then." 10 days later, the moment they received the notice from my lawyer, they called me 93 times and left 57 voicemails. What would you do if your parents asked you to take a DNA test for your child in front of a bunch of people? I've been in that situation. My 10-year-old son doesn't look anything like me, and that bothered my parents. At Christmas dinner, they refused to give my son any Christmas gifts and publicly demanded I get a DNA test in front of 33 guests. More importantly, they said this in front of my son. Why would they be so heartless? Let's follow the story. I'll tell you what happened. Before I delve into the details, I would like to express my sincere gratitude from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story. Hello everyone, I'm Owen, 40 years old, currently serving as operations director for a canned food company in San Diego, California. 2 years have passed since my wife, son, and I left Los Angeles, but the wounds in my heart still haven't fully healed. Every time I close my eyes, I can still hear every cruel word my parents said. The decision to sever all ties with my family wasn't easy. In 40 years of life, I never imagined I'd face this choice. But when they dared to question my son's bloodline, when they made Mason listen to insults about himself, I knew I had no other option. Anna, my wife, the woman who has stood by me for 15 years, deserves better respect than that. Mason, our well-behaved and intelligent son, was given a childhood free from discrimination by his own grandparents. San Diego is our home now. No more tense family gatherings, no more degrading comparisons, no more suspicious looks. Just me, Anna, and Mason building a new life from the pieces of our past. People often ask if I regret it. The answer is always no, because sometimes in life, you have to choose between blood and happiness. And I decided on my little family's happiness. The story I'm sharing today took place during Christmas 2023. Christmas is supposed to be a time for families to reunite and enjoy warm moments together. But for my little family, that Christmas became an unforgettable nightmare. It was the deep hurt Mason had to bear, the humiliating tears of my wife, Anna. And for me, it was overwhelming disappointment in the people I once called dad, mom, and brother. That afternoon around 5:30, I drove Anna and Mason to my parents' house. Mason was only 10 then, sitting in the back seat and constantly asking about the gifts Grandpa and Grandma might give him. Throughout the long drive from North Los Angeles to the suburbs, he sang along to Christmas songs on the radio with bright, excited eyes. While my son was excited, I felt a heaviness weighing on my chest. The familiar tension started creeping in as I thought about facing over 30 relatives, especially Matthew's family, my brother. The endless comparisons between me and Matthew had become an unavoidable part of every family gathering. Since we were kids, they compared us on everything. School grades, sports achievements, our careers, and even our families. Matthew was always praised for his outgoing personality and excellent communication skills. While I was perceived as shy and unambitious, despite my income being double his, I knew if we didn't show up, Mom and Dad would call constantly and create unnecessary drama. So, despite being reluctant, I still decided to bring my wife and child to the party. If only I'd known this would be the last time we'd sit at the same table with them, I probably would have turned the car around right away. Right after I parked and walked into the living room, the familiar atmosphere of family gatherings surrounded me. The room was packed with people filled with loud chatter and laughter echoing from every corner. I led Anna and Mason inside, trying to keep a smile on my face, even though I was already starting to feel uncomfortable. Right after greeting a few relatives near the door, I turned around to find a place for Mason to put his little backpack. Just then, the familiar whispers started up behind me. Uncle Robert's voice, Dad's cousin, came through pretty clearly, even though he was trying to speak quietly. "Look at Mason. He doesn't look anything like Owen." Right after that, Aunt Karen, who always loved prying into other people's business, replied with a mysterious tone, "Exactly. Maybe Mason isn't Owen's kid." Uncle Robert quickly interrupted with a worried voice. "Shoo, keep it down. Owen might hear, and that'll be trouble." But Aunt Karen didn't stop. She even raised her voice a bit higher like she wanted to make sure everyone around could hear. "What's the big deal? That's the truth. Look at Alex, Matthew's son. The boy looks exactly like Matthew when he was little. Like 2 drops of water." The blood in my body felt like it was boiling. I spun around and walked straight to where these 2 gossipy relatives were standing in front of them. I gritted each word through my teeth. "Watch your words. Don't think I can hear you." Uncle Robert's face went pale instantly. Aunt Karen opened her mouth to say something back, but Uncle Robert quickly put his hand on her shoulder, shaking his head to signal silence. Both of them stepped back, eyes not daring to look straight at me. Just when the tension reached its peak, Dad appeared from the kitchen. He looked around suspiciously, then asked loudly, "What's going on here, everyone?" Uncle Robert swallowed hard, then quickly answered, "Nothing. We were just saying hello to each other. Right after that answer, Dad nodded slowly, his probing gaze sweeping over each person. When he turned to look at my family, there wasn't a bit of warmth on his face. Not a smile, not a word of welcome for his son and grandson as they came home. Instead, he coldly ordered like he was talking to hired help. "Since you're here, help me and your mom prepare for the party. Matthew's family is helping with the barbecue outside." His words hit me like a bucket of cold water to the face, but I was too used to Dad's attitude. Anna squeezed my hand gently, her eyes saying it all. She understood the pain I was enduring. Mason stood next to us. The boy looked up at me with confused eyes, not understanding why Grandpa was so cold, not wanting to disrupt the atmosphere further. I led Anna down to the kitchen. Mason followed behind, his little hand gripping Mom's tightly. In the kitchen, my mom was struggling with a large tray of food. She looked up at us, nodded in greeting, then pointed to some other food trays. "Take these to the living room for me." Throughout the preparation time, I tried not to think about the venomous whispers from relatives, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning of a stormy Christmas night. Around 6:30 that evening, the dining table in the living room was fully set. The aroma of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and traditional Christmas dishes filled the space. I led Anna and Mason toward the chairs near Mom and Dad's position where, according to tradition, direct children always sat. Just as I put my hand on the back of the chair, Mom suddenly raised her hand to signal stop and said in a tone as natural as if she were arranging seats for guests, "Owen, your family sits at the end of the table. Help me take care of the guests sitting in that area." Those words made me freeze. In nearly 40 years, Mom had never asked me to sit so far away. I looked at Mom, trying to find something in her eyes, but she had already turned away and was busy arranging seats for Matthew and his wife and kids right next to her. Mason looked up at me with questioning eyes. The boy tugged gently on my shirt and asked quietly, "Why can't we sit near Grandpa and Grandma?" Dad, faced with my child's innocent question, I didn't know how to answer. Anna quickly bent down, stroked our son's hair, and gently explained, "Grandpa and Grandma just want us to help take care of everyone." "Sweetie." Mason nodded after that answer and didn't ask anything more. We silently moved to the end of the table. The chairs there were strange and cold, as if we really were just guests at this family gathering. From this position, I could see the entire dining table. Mom and Dad sat at the head of the table with Matthew and his family arranged right next to them, while we were pushed to the farthest corner, sitting with some distant relatives whose names I couldn't even remember. Throughout dinner, I witnessed Mom and Dad constantly paying attention to Alex, Matthew's son. Mom served the boy food and patted his head with loving eyes. Dad told funny stories that made Alex giggle. Meanwhile, Mason sat silently next to me, occasionally glancing toward Grandpa and Grandma with eyes longing for attention. Anna noticed the hurt in our son's eyes. She took my hand under the table, squeezed gently, and whispered in my ear comfortingly, "I'm sure Mom and Dad don't mean anything by it." I nodded, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. But deep down, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This was their way of clearly showing that my family wasn't as welcome as Matthew's family. Looking at Mason with his head down, eating in silence, my heart felt squeezed tight. My 10-year-old son didn't deserve to endure this discrimination. Anna tried to make dinner less tense by chatting with Mason about plans for the upcoming winter break. But I could see the sadness in both their eyes. Right then, I realized something. We had truly become outsiders in our own family. Halfway through the party, when the atmosphere had warmed up thanks to wine and laughter, the first argument suddenly broke out. Aunt Karen, after finishing her third or fourth glass of wine, had flushed cheeks and her tongue was starting to loosen. She always loved getting attention from my parents, and that Christmas party was no exception. From her seat in the middle of the table, she stood up unsteadily, raising her wine glass toward the head of the table where my parents were sitting. With a voice louder than usual due to the effects of alcohol, Aunt Karen said toward my parents, looking at Alex, "I'm reminded of Matthew when he was little. Alex looks exactly like Matthew. No difference at all." Mom smiled proudly, nodded in agreement, and replied with an excited voice, "Exactly. You can tell right away he's Matthew's son." At this point, Aunt Karen seemed to get more motivated. She turned around, looking toward the end of the table where we were sitting. Her eyes swept over Mason, then looked back at me with a face like she was considering a complex math problem. She continued with an even louder voice, "But looking at Mason, Owen's kid, he doesn't look like Owen one bit. I keep staring but can't find any similarities at all." After that statement, the room suddenly went silent. The sound of knives and forks hitting plates also stopped. Mason, sitting next to me, froze stiff. The boy looked down at his plate, his little hands gripping each other tightly under the table. Immediately, Anna pulled our son close to her, her face turning pale. I felt blood rushing to my head, both hands clenching tight. But before I could react, I noticed something strange. My parents' faces suddenly tensed up. Dad frowned at Aunt Karen with obvious annoyance. Mom pursed her lips, her face hardening. Several relatives sitting near Aunt Karen quickly grabbed her arm, signaling for her to sit down. Everyone could feel the tension enveloping the room. Uncle Robert whispered something in his wife's ear, but Aunt Karen still stood there, swaying slightly with the wine glass in her hand. Just when the atmosphere was tense like a guitar string about to snap, Uncle James, Dad's younger brother, quickly stood up with a forced smile. He raised his wine glass high and said with a deliberately cheerful voice, "Come on, raise your glasses, everyone. Let's celebrate a Merry Christmas." Everyone seemed to have just escaped from a nightmare, quickly raising their glasses. The sound of glasses clinking rang out loudly, trying to dispel the heavy atmosphere that had been present before. Aunt Karen was pressed down into her seat by Uncle Robert, and the party continued, but I could clearly see the angry expressions on my parents' faces. They looked toward the end of the table, where Mason was trying to swallow each bite of food with red-rimmed eyes. Their gaze wasn't the look of grandparents protecting their grandson from insults. It was a look of irritation, as if Mason had done something wrong. Anna gently rubbed Mason's back, trying to comfort our son, but I knew the boy had heard and understood everything. At that moment, sitting there watching my parents return to cheerful conversation with Matthew and his wife, as if nothing had happened, I suddenly realized a painful truth. They weren't angry because someone had insulted their grandson. They were angry because Aunt Karen's words had struck a chord with something they had also been thinking. And I had no idea that their simmering anger would soon be unleashed on an innocent 10-year-old child. Around 8 o'clock that evening, after the last plate was cleared from the table, Dad stood up and clapped his hands to get everyone's attention. He smiled brightly and announced with an excited voice, "Time to give gifts to the kids." The children's cheers echoed throughout the room. They gathered around the beautifully decorated Christmas tree in the corner of the room. Mason also stood up, his eyes lighting up with hope. Each gift was called by name and handed over to its recipient. The nephews and nieces received toys, books, and new clothes. Every child was called by name affectionately by my parents along with some praise or warm wishes. When it was Alex's turn, Dad brought out a giant gift box carefully wrapped in shiny gold paper with a red bow. He placed it down in front of Alex with a proud expression and roared for the whole room to hear. "This is a gift for my beloved grandson." Alex, the 12-year-old boy with blonde hair exactly like Matthew's, excitedly tore off the wrapping paper when the brand new iPad Pro appeared. The whole room gasped in amazement. Mom patted Alex's head and said in an affectionate voice, "Grandpa and Grandma are giving you this so you can research study materials and develop your talents." Break time. Sad face, 700 milliseconds. / Matthew stood beside him smiling smugly. His wife kept taking pictures. Everyone applauded and praised my parents' generosity. And then the gift-giving ended. The room gradually returned to quiet as everyone returned to their seats. All the children were holding their gifts except for one person, my son. Mason still stood there looking around with confused eyes. The boy waited a few more seconds, hoping someone would call his name, but nothing happened. Finally, Mason came back to me. The boy tugged on my sleeve, his voice trembling, almost choking. "Dad, why didn't Grandpa and Grandma give me a gift? Do they hate me?" Anna quickly pulled Mason into her arms, hugged our son tightly, and comforted him with a voice, trying to stay calm. "Maybe Grandpa and Grandma just forgot. They'll give you a gift in a bit." Mason looked up at his mother, tears rolling down his cheeks. The boy asked with a broken voice, "Is it because I don't look like Dad that Grandpa and Grandma hate me, Mom?" Mason's question hit me like a bucket of cold water over my head. The 10-year-old boy had heard and understood all the vicious words throughout the evening. The whispers, the looks, the discrimination, and now being excluded from the gift list. Looking at my son trembling in Anna's arms. Looking at the heartbroken tears of an innocent child, the fire of anger in me blazed fiercely. I swept my eyes around the room. My parents were chatting happily with Matthew as if nothing had happened. Relatives deliberately turned their faces away. No one dared to speak up. At that moment, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. My son didn't deserve to be treated like this. I had to make everything clear right now. I stood up from the chair at the end of the table, feeling all eyes in the room converging on me. Mason was still sobbing in Anna's arms. Seeing my son hurt like that, the anger in me blazed uncontrollably. I walked toward my parents who were sitting at the head of the table. When I got close, I slammed my wine glass down hard on the table, creating an echoing sound that made the whole room jump. All conversation stopped. Standing straight, I looked directly into my parents' eyes and asked in a cold voice, "Why doesn't Mason have a gift?" Mom looked up, her face showing clear annoyance. She replied with a sharp, contemptuous voice, "Mason embarrassed us, and now he wants gifts." Mom's words left me stunned. I couldn't believe what I just heard. Trying to contain my boiling anger, I asked again with a trembling voice, "What did Mason do to embarrass you?" At this point, Dad jumped in. He stood up from his chair and pointed straight at my face. "Are you still asking? Didn't you hear what Karen said earlier? He doesn't look anything like you." Just when the atmosphere became suffocatingly tense, Uncle James quickly stood up from his seat. With a worried expression, he raised both hands to signal everyone to calm down and said in a reconciling voice, "Come on, everyone. Today is Christmas. Don't fight." Immediately, I turned to look at Uncle James. With a voice full of bitterness, I replied to him, "Exactly. Today is Christmas. And my parents gave gifts to all the grandchildren, but excluded my son. How ridiculous." The room fell so silent you could hear the clock ticking. Everyone held their breath, waiting for something about to happen. Mason from the back of the room had stopped crying. The boy was looking toward me with swollen eyes. At this point, Mom stood up and she stepped closer to me. Her voice was ice cold when she said, "Owen, it's been 10 years. I'm giving you real advice. You should take Mason for a DNA test. We're tired of comparisons about how Mason doesn't look anything like you." Mom's words hit me like a slap in the face. I felt my hands and feet trembling, not from fear, but from overwhelming anger. But before I could react, Matthew had stood up from his seat next to my parents. He approached me with a smug expression, standing just a few steps away from me. With a tone like he was pitying me, Matthew said, "Owen, stop being stubborn. Look, Mason doesn't look anything like you. From the facial features to the physical appearance. Even his hair color isn't the same." Right when Matthew finished speaking, I couldn't control myself anymore. I screamed with all my strength, "Shut up, unless you want me to beat you up." My scream echoed throughout the room, making several children jump and cry out. Matthew stepped back, his face turning pale. The whole room sank into heavy silence. No one dared to breathe hard, let alone speak up. I swept my eyes around the room. Horrified faces, scared faces, and curious eyes watching me. But I didn't care anymore. They had crossed the line by daring to insult my son. After a few suffocatingly silent seconds, I turned back to look straight into my parents' eyes. My voice was terrifyingly calm when I said, "Fine, I'll listen to Mom and Dad. I'll take Mason for a DNA test." Hearing my words, Mom smiled triumphantly. But that smile quickly faded when I continued. "But I have something I want to say to Mom and Dad. I think Matthew and I should both take DNA tests with Dad because looking closely, we don't have anything in common with him at all." My words made Dad furious. With his face turning bright red, he slammed his hand down on the table, making the glasses shake, then shouted, "Enough. Shut up." But I couldn't stop anymore. Years of being looked down on, compared, and treated like an outsider had pushed me to my limit. With a voice cold as ice, I continued, "Dad, you've been cheated on. Mom had an affair and gave birth to Matthew and me. Don't you see that? Matthew and I don't look anything like Dad. Perhaps we should all consider getting DNA tests. What do you think about this suggestion, Dad?" Immediately, Dad collapsed into his chair like a puppet with cut strings. His right hand went to his chest, his face pale and breathing with difficulty. It was the first time in my life I'd seen him so angry and shocked. Seeing her husband provoked to such anger, Mom screamed in an almost insane voice, "Enough, Owen, enough." But I didn't stop at all. I looked straight into Mom's eyes, feeling a strange calmness envelope me with a loud and clear voice for the whole room to hear. I declared, "Congratulations, Mom and Dad. From now on, you only have one son, Matthew, and one grandson, Alex. I'm done with you." Right after my declaration, Mom jumped up, eyes wide. Looking at me with disbelief, she asked loudly, "What do you mean? How dare you talk to your mother like that?" I took a deep breath, feeling like I was shedding a burden I'd carried for 40 years. Looking straight into Mom's eyes, I said, "Anna and I loved each other for 5 years before we got married. I trust my wife and anyone who insults my wife, my son, I won't forgive." I paused a bit, swept my eyes around the room, then continued, "Mom should look again. Both Matthew and I, neither of us looks like Dad. You're suggesting Anna, my wife, had an affair, but I think you're talking about yourself." The room exploded after that statement. Whispers and gasps rang out from everywhere. Several relatives stood up to intervene, but no one dared to come close. Matthew stood there with a pale face, speechless. Mom was so angry that her whole body was shaking. She pointed straight at my face, her lips moving, wanting to say something, but she couldn't form words. Maybe she was too shocked by what I just said. Or perhaps she knew that anything she said now would only make things worse. Right after that, I turned around, walked toward Anna and Mason. My son was looking at me with wide eyes, a mix of fear and admiration. Anna stood up and took my hand. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said everything about her support and love. I bent down, picked up Mason, and said gently, "Let's go home, son." Mason hugged my neck tightly and nodded. The boy whispered in my ear, "I love you, Dad." Those simple words brought tears to my eyes. I hugged my son tight, feeling all the anger disappear. The only thing that mattered then was protecting my little family. We walked out of that house in absolute silence. No one said goodbye. No one tried to hold us back. Perhaps they were too shocked. Or maybe they knew that things had gone too far to be salvaged. When we got to the car, I put Mason in the back seat. The boy had stopped crying, but his eyes were still red-rimmed. Anna sat silently in the passenger seat. I started the engine and drove away from the familiar street that I'd probably never return to. After the car had been driving for about 5 minutes, when we'd reached the main road, Anna quietly turned to look at me. She took my hand, which was resting on the gear shift, and said gently, "Thank you for protecting Mason and me." I glanced at my wife, seeing her eyes also welling up. I smiled, a sad but also relieved smile, and replied, "You and Mason are everything to me. I have to protect you and our son." Hearing that, Anna laughed. Her laughter rang out in the quiet space of the car, dispelling some of the heavy atmosphere. Mason from the back seat also smiled along. In that moment, as I drove through the cold Christmas night, I realized something. I might have lost my birth family, but I still had my real family sitting right in this car. And that was all I needed. That evening, after my wife and son had fallen asleep, I still sat alone on the sofa in the living room. The whiskey glass in my hand was nearly empty, but I still didn't want to go to bed. The house was shrouded in darkness with only the street light filtering through the window, creating faint streaks of light on the wall. In that suffocatingly silent space, memories began flooding back like endless waves. I remembered my childhood, the days when family was still a real family. Sunday mornings when Dad took Matthew and me fishing. Evenings when Mom cooked our favorite meals. Times when the whole family gathered together to watch movies on Friday nights. But even in those beautiful memories, I realized the seeds of discrimination had existed very early. When Matthew was praised for his handsome appearance, I was compared to the ugly child. When Matthew skillfully sweet-talked adults, I was criticized for being shy and clumsy. Matthew inherited from Dad those classic handsome features. A face with sharp lines, deep blue eyes, and shining blonde hair. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a well-proportioned body. Meanwhile, I with dark brown hair, black eyes, and a shorter stature looked like a stranger in my own family. As we grew up, the comparisons shifted in another direction. I studied diligently and graduated from college with honors. I climbed to the operations director position at just 28 years old with a six-figure income that Matthew never achieved. Meanwhile, he remained just an ordinary salesperson, living off his gift of gab and sweet-talking customers. But that didn't matter to my parents. Matthew was still the favorite child, the one who brought them pride. All because Alex, his son, looked exactly like him. Every time someone complimented how Alex resembled Matthew, my parents would beam like blooming flowers. They were proud of the bloodline being passed down perfectly. Meanwhile, my Mason with black hair and brown eyes like Anna's became evidence of their suspicions. Suspicions about my wife's faithfulness, suspicions about my son's bloodline, and perhaps deeper down, disappointment that I couldn't give them a grandson who carried the family resemblance. I took the last sip of whiskey, feeling the burning taste spread down my throat. Setting the empty glass on the table, I looked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom where Anna and Mason were sleeping soundly. The two most important people in my life, two people who had been unforgivably insulted. Right then, a thought suddenly flashed in my head. In the darkness of the quiet living room, I was determined to take back everything that belonged to me. Not for money, but for the sake of justice for my little family. The days after that fateful Christmas night passed in absolute silence. Not a single call, not a single text from my parents or Matthew. That silence both relieved me and evoked an indescribable sadness. 40 years of being a son, being a brother, and everything ended in silence like that. But I knew the silence couldn't last forever, especially when I decided to take back what belonged to me. 2 days after Christmas, I called David, a close friend from college, and also the best lawyer I knew. When David answered, I said immediately, "I need you to help me with something important." That afternoon, I sat in David's office holding a box of documents in my hand. Inside were all the papers related to the $300,000 loan from 2018. I still remember clearly that day when my parents sat in my living room, faces pale because they were about to lose their house. In October 2018, my parents failed at investing in a real estate project. They lost almost all their savings and still owed the bank $300,000 with their house as collateral. The bank threatened to foreclose if they couldn't pay the debt within 30 days. In desperation, my parents came to me. First, I refused. $300,000 wasn't a small amount, and I knew the chances of them paying it back were very low. But then Mom cried, and Dad begged. They proposed a deal. I would own 75% of the house's value, and they promised to add my name to the ownership papers as soon as all procedures were completed. Compassion made me agree. I transferred the money to them, saving the house from bank foreclosure. But 5 years had passed, and my name still hadn't been added to the ownership papers as they promised. Every time I mentioned it, they came up with excuses to delay. David carefully reviewed the papers, nodded and said, "Everything is legal. They can't deny it. Either add your name to the deed or sell the house, and pay you 75%. I nodded and signed the power of attorney, giving David full authority to handle the case. When I left the office, I knew the storm was coming. And as predicted, 10 days later, when the holidays ended, David sent a legal notice to my parents and my phone went off the hook. 93 missed calls within 3 hours. 57 voicemails are filling up my mailbox. I didn't answer once, but curiosity made me listen to a few voicemails. The first message was Mom's voice, trembling and choking. "Owen, what are you doing? How could you do this to your parents?" The second message, Dad's voice full of anger. "You ungrateful child, demanding money back from your own parents." Then Matthew with a contemptuous tone. "You're disgusting, Owen. Over something small. You dare destroy the family." I deleted them all without listening to more. After that, I blocked all 3 of their numbers. Marcus, a close neighbor, called to report that they'd come to my house many times, banging on the door loudly and shouting in the yard, but they didn't know that my family and I were no longer there. From early morning on December 26th, just one day after Christmas, Anna and I had decided to leave Los Angeles. The house in San Diego that I bought in August 2023 as an investment unexpectedly became the perfect refuge. Initially, I planned to rent it out, but after what happened, it became our new home. Anna didn't ask many questions when I suggested moving immediately. She understood that we needed a fresh start away from the toxicity of my birth family. Mason was excited about this sudden adventure. The boy didn't understand everything, but probably sensed that we were escaping something terrible. We only brought the essentials, clothes, a few keepsakes, and important documents. The rest would be moved later or maybe sold. I didn't want to bring too many memories from our old life. 10 days in San Diego were like a beautiful dream. We explored the new city, walked on the beach, and built sand castles with Mason. The boy laughed more, was happier, as if an invisible burden had been lifted from his small shoulders. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, David was doing his job. He called to report progress every day. My parents initially tried to resist, found their own lawyer. But when they realized they had no chance of winning, they had to give in. Sitting on the balcony of the new house in San Diego, watching Mason play in the yard, I realized that I didn't want revenge at all. I just wanted justice, and more importantly, I wanted freedom for my family. Just 20 days after receiving the legal notice, David called me with the news I'd been waiting for. His voice rang through the phone with obvious satisfaction. They agreed. "Owen, sell the house and pay you 75%. Hearing this information, I sat down in the nearest chair, feeling a strange sense of relief spread throughout my body, not because of the money, but because finally justice had been served. David told me the details of what had happened. My parents and Matthew had gone to 3 different law offices, hoping to find loopholes in the agreement. But the evidence was too clear. Papers with both parties' signatures notarized. When they realized they had no chance of winning, they faced 2 choices. Either add my name to the house papers and share ownership or sell the house. They chose the second option, probably because they couldn't bear the thought of sharing the house with the son they just abandoned. The house selling process went quickly. The Los Angeles real estate market was hot, and the well-located house attracted many buyers. Finally, it sold for $600,000. 2 months later, I received $450,000. Looking at the money transferred into my bank account, I didn't feel as happy as I'd expected. Instead, there was a lingering sadness. This wasn't just money, but also the final period of a 40-year relationship with my birth family. Part 12. 2 years have passed since that fateful Christmas night. San Diego has truly become our home now. Mason is 12 years old, taller, more confident, and most importantly, the boy no longer has to bear the burden of comparisons and suspicions. I completely cut contact with my birth family. No phone calls, no texts, no social media. Sometimes I wonder how they're living after losing their house. How are my aging parents now? Where are Matthew and his family living? But those questions pass by and disappear. They chose their path, and I chose mine. Anna sometimes asks if I regret it. The answer is always no. Over the past 2 years, I've seen Mason grow up in a healthy environment, free from discrimination and poisonous words. The boy is proud of himself, of his family, and that's what matters most. Through my story, I want to give advice to anyone enduring family comparisons or parents whose children are being compared. Don't stay silent. Don't let that toxicity corrode your soul and your child's soul. Family isn't just about blood. A real family is where you're loved unconditionally and accepted with all your strengths and weaknesses. If blood relatives can't give you that, don't hesitate to walk away because life is too short to live in the shadow of contempt. I lost my birth family, but I kept my real family. I lost my parents and brother, but I protected my son from psychological harm. And for me, that was a worthy trait. My story ends here. But before I finish, I want to ask you a question. If you were in my situation, when your own parents demanded a DNA test of your child right in the middle of a family party, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. I really want to know what you think about this story and my decision. And if this story was good and meaningful, Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. Thank you for listening to my story.